Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information, whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who is interested in learning more. We hope that you enjoy today's session on public housing and housing choice voucher, a refresher. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugee paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. As a reminder for everyone joining us today, everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you're having any technical issues, please submit a question in the chat or the question box so we can assist you. There will be time at the end for a Q&A. And additionally, the presentation, any resources and recordings will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. So this brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter is Lynette Pearl with CWS's Refugee Housing Solutions. Welcome.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you for having me again. I think it's important that we do a refresher course on public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program, because even though there have been such long waiting lists, but we are seeing some trends where some waiting lists are opening up. So we've gotten a lot of TA about how do I get a client or walk a client to get actually on those waiting lists, or how does public housing and housing choice voucher programs work? So we're going to go ahead and get into this training about that. So thank you for having me again. So let me share my screen. And can you guys see my screen?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay, so let's get started. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Refugee Housing Solutions because it's very important, because we provide a lot of resources and we do a lot of collaborations. And this is just an example of some of the collaborations we do. But we also have a lot of technical assistance, educational materials, fact sheets, toolkits. So I highly encourage a lot of your attendees to go to our website to check out all our information we have available. We do have it sectioned out. We have things available for landlords, property managers, sponsors, volunteers. So please, please, please go to our website. And then one thing we do provide technical assistance. And our technical assistance is not just for resettlement agencies or staff, but also for volunteers and sponsors. And if you're a landlord or property manager, you have some questions about the resettlement, you can simply schedule an appointment with one of our team members, and you can go to our website and under our TA tab, enter your contact information and details of your TA request into our booking schedule. And this is just a snapshot of what our toolkits look like and just a few resources that we have on our website. So let's go ahead and get started. We have some learning objectives. We are going to cover what public housing and the housing choice voucher programs are and how they work. I also am going to cover the eligibility requirements in the workflow for each program, so participants can understand the workflows. They're kind of similar, but slightly different. And we're going to go from application process up to the lease up. And one important thing I want to talk about too is program terminology. So when you're seeing terminology, when you're helping an actual client apply for public housing and housing choice voucher program, you can understand what that terminology means. So housing assistant is what the Department of Housing and Urban Development is best known for. And this is a service that most people think of when they hear the name HUD. And that is with good reason. HUD programs help hundreds of thousands of individuals and families achieve safe and secure housing each year. In fact, HUD estimates that 1.2 million households are living in public housing. Now, that is a significant portion of the United States population. Now, there are several housing subsidies in affordable housing program HUD has, with the largest being the mortgage and loan insurance through the Federal Housing Administration. Then you have the Community Development Block Grants, which is known as CDBG, and you have Home Investment Partnership Act. I'm sorry, I thought my phone was turned off. And public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher, formerly known as Section 8. This webinar will focus on the basic operations of public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher program. So how does public housing work? Well, public housing programs, they do provide direct payments to public housing agencies and Indian housing authorities to develop and operate housing for low-income families. Now, the Office of Public and Indian Housing administers HUD's public housing programs. So how do the housing get help? How does the homeless get help from HUD? Well, HUD funds state and local governments and nonprofit organizations to assist low-income individuals and families. Now, the funds are used to help the homeless move from the streets to temporary shelters and to supportive housing with services if necessary. We're going to start with public housing first. Public housing, they are properties are owned by the government authorities and they're funded through HUD, but they're administered by a local public housing authority, which is known as PHA. Now, it is available for low-income families and individuals whose household income is less than 80% of the area's median income, which is known as AMI. And the Housing Choice Voucher Program is similar to public housing program. It is also funded through HUD. It's administered by a local housing authority and available for low-income families and individuals whose household income is less than 80% AMI. Now, with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, it is the federal government's largest program that assists the elderly, disabled, and low-income families in securing housing in the private market. So that's key, private market. Now, since housing assistance is provided on the family's or individual's behalf, participants can find their own housing, including single-family homes, townhomes, and apartments. So with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, the subsidy is paid directly to the landlord or property management company by the housing authority on behalf of the participating family. Now, the participating family, they are still responsible for paying the difference. They're going to pay up to almost 30% of the income towards their rent. And so one thing I would like to mention with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, you got to have a landlord that's willing to participate and also meet the Housing Choice Voucher criteria. So you can have a landlord say, hey, I want to put up my property. I want to accept a Housing Choice Voucher, but they need to understand there is a process. And they also have to go through inspections and also the proper paperwork to actually become a Housing Choice Voucher landlord. And I also want to talk about this too, because there's a lot of confusion with a Housing Choice Voucher versus project-based assistance. The Housing Choice Voucher Program, if you have a client that has a Housing Choice Voucher, think of voucher, I'm vouching. That voucher is attached to them. So they can have that subsidy as long as they qualify for that subsidy and they say, I want to move, I live in Texas, I want to take my Housing Choice Voucher to Illinois. They can transport, we call it porting, they can port that actual voucher to another state or even port that voucher to another housing authority. Now, when you have a project base, remember, I'm on a base, the subsidy is tied to the unit. So as long as that client lives in the unit, they have the subsidy. But the minute they leave or move, unless they move into another project base, they no longer have the subsidy. And I want to make sure I clarify that because in the past, I have worked with clients that got confused. They thought they actually had a portable Housing Choice Voucher and they actually lived in a project base. So I just want to clarify that. And I kind of want to break down the roles because I'm a visual person. So this is the roles of public housing programs. So you have HUD. HUD covers the cost of the program. And that program cost is the funding is trickled down to the local PHA. Now you have the PHA. Now the PHA administers the program. They meet HUD's program requirement and they provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing through government-owned buildings. And the tenant's role is to meet the program requirements. And we're going to talk a little bit about what tenant responsibilities are as well. Now you have the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is slightly different, and we'll talk about what the Housing Choice Voucher Program is in the flow chart. Again, HUD covers the cost of the program and provides the fund directly to the PHA. The PHA is responsible for administering the program, and it enters into a contract with the landlord. Like I stated earlier, there is a contract with the landlord, and we'll talk about what that's called. It's called the HAP payment. That's one of the terminologies that is used in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and this housing assistant payment. So they enter into a contract with the actual PHA and the landlord. Then the landlord has a role. Their role is to provide decent, safe, and sanitary housing. That's why they have to pass a lot of inspections criteria and meet the program requirements. And again, the tenant role is to meet program requirements. So we're going to go ahead and talk about eligibility because that's a very important thing. So I'm going to cover basic requirements when we talk about eligibility for public housing and housing choice voucher. And the reason why is because each PHA is slightly different with their requirements. So we're going to just talk about the general requirements and the minimum requirements PHA review for eligibility. So even though PHAs, they are governed by HUD and they are independent agencies and but they do have some autonomy in their policies and procedures to address the housing needs of their community. So that's why if you have a housing authority in Chicago, it might be slightly different from a housing authority in Dallas. We're going to talk about the first requirement is family. Family is defined by HUD's 24 CFR includes, but is not limited to the following, regardless of actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. A single person who may be an elderly person, disabled person, near elderly person, or any other single person, or a group of persons residing together. So such groups includes, but is not limited to a family with or without children. A child who's temporarily away from home because placement in foster care is considered a member of the family. Now, an elderly family or a near elderly family is considered a disabled family or a displaced family, or the remaining member of a tenant family. So there's so many definitions. So when a client applies for housing, they should also find out, again, that PHA's policy and definition was considered a family. The PHA can determine if any other group of person qualify as a family. Now, I want to point out that the term household, it does differ from family. Household is a broader term that includes additional people with the PHA's permission who may live in the unit. And this could consist of, for example, of a live-in aid. If you have a client that needs assistance to be independent and the doctor has given them a live-in aid, they would be not part of the family, but part of the household. Or if you have a client, they decide they're stable, they want to bring in foster children, that foster child or a foster adult, that would be part of the household. So the next one is head of household requirements. With the head of household requirement, the applicant must be at least 18 years of age at the time of application or an emancipated minor by a court of competent jurisdiction. Now, that is consistent with that state law was considered an emancipated minor. So those are requirements for the head of household. We're going to talk about income requirements. HUD does establish income limits by family size for the area in which each housing authority is located. These income limits are used to determine the family's eligibility for the program and are published annually in a HUD notice and effective on that publication date. I've been out of the housing game for a while when it comes to public housing, but I remember that it did used to roll out, the new requirements would roll out April 1st for each year. So at the time of the application and the eligibility interview, the family income and size cannot exceed the established income limits and household size established by HUD. Now, to be eligible for the program, a family must either be very low income, generally 50% area median income, or low income. So I like to give examples. So this is an example. I pulled this an example of income requirements for a certain area. I'm going to pick on myself. This is Johnson County, Missouri. This is Casey, Kansas City, Missouri. This is what the income guidelines is for Kansas City, Missouri, or Johnson County. And as you can see, I want you to focus on, we're going to focus on a family of four, 50% low income limit. So in order to qualify, I'm just using this example, for a family of four and have to be 50% AMI, that family of four cannot make more than $43,000 a year. So I want you to keep that number in mind because I'm going to jump to another area, another county. Now here is a snapshot of Cook County. As you can see, it's slightly different. It's almost $16,000 difference. So in Cook County, a family of four can't make no more than $56,050. So that's why it's important that when you are trying to assist a family in applying for public housing or a housing subsidy, you know what the income requirements is, for that program, but where do they stand on this chart? Because that can help you determine if they're the income eligible. Again, it's very important that you narrow it down to a specific area because you could be working with clients in different counties and it can have different requirements. We're going to talk about the student status. At higher education institutions who do not reside with their parents must meet additional eligibility criteria. Now, this rules apply regardless whether the student is considered a full-time or a part-time student. Assistance should only be provided to students who are otherwise eligible for the program and meet at least one of the following criteria. And again, all this material will be provided to you, and due to time, I'm not going to go through each and one, but I just want to give you a snapshot of what the criteria is when they look at the student status. We're going to talk about one that's very important to this group is citizen status. At least one individual in the household must be either a U.S. citizen or an eligible, it's called non-citizen, to qualify for the Public and Housing Choice Voucher Program. And that's another training because there's different levels, different immigration categories that was considered a non-citizen. So you're wondering what a non-citizen is. So based on HUD's definition, a non-citizen is a person who's neither a U.S. citizen nor a national of the United States. Now, a household in which at least one member is a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen may also be eligible for prorated assistance. So this type of household is considered a mixed household. That's what HUD calls it, a mixed household. So when you have a mixed household, HUD does prorate the assistance based on the number of eligible family members and not the total number of people in the household. So for example, if there is a household of four, you got a household of four now, and only two are eligible for the program, the subsidy would be for a two-person household instead of four, because only two people are eligible. So I just want to make sure we're clear on that. And again, if you have any questions about non-citizens who do qualify, we do provide TA on this. We do have a team of people who are experts in that. I've been in housing for 20 years and I was a Section 8 director. So reach out to us if you have any questions about this. Because a lot of people get confused and say, well, I applied and I have a family of five. I said, well, if you break that family of five down, how many actually qualified for the program? Does not mean they still can live in the unit, but your subsidy is going to be reflective of how many qualify. Now, this chart, it does need to be updated because we have so many new immigration status are coming out. But this is kind of an overview of who is considered a non-citizen that is eligible for public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So again, we will be updating this because things are changing so rapidly in this space. But this can give you just a general idea who can apply for public housing and for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Now, this is one of the frequently asked questions. Public housing also do verify citizenship with refugees or parolee members throughout the U.S. Citizens and Immigration Service system. And this is a system, it's called the SAVE system. And this is a snapshot of one of the, like I said, FQAs HUD receives from housing providers guarding citizens verification. Again, this will be provided for you. So even if you have a client, again, it takes a lot to apply for public housing and a housing choice voucher program. But guess what? There is a system in place that they do use just to determine, just to make sure that they do qualify. And this is called the SAVE system. And we have the criminal background check. The criminal background check requires all adult family members must pass the PHA's criminal background check and screening to ensure no household member is subjected to a lifetime sex offender registration requirements. Background check requires will vary from each public housing authority. Now, all adult members must sign a criminal background consent form to authorize the PHA to conduct background screenings. Now, with your population, if your client has I-94, this could meet the background check criteria. Now, also the PHA, again, chooses to establish additional criteria because there can be some additional criteria for background check standards. So it's important that you know the PHA's ACOP, which is the we're going to talk about ACOP and administrative plan. Again, those are acronyms I'm using that is used in this space, but we'll talk about what that is. So I just want to make sure that we talk about background check, that if your client has their I-94 card, this could meet that criteria for the background check. So let's dig a little deeper into public housing. And we're going to talk to help you understand public housing and the housing choice voucher programs better. I'm going to go over some, not all the terminology because there's a lot, but I'm going to try to go over the common terminology that's used during the application process. So I'm going to cover those. To implement fair housing laws and to protect the rights of applicants and residents, HUD does require housing authorities to operate under an admissions and continued occupancy policy called the ACOP. That's what I just mentioned. It's called the ACOP. Now, the ACOP, it is a written document that governs the public housing program. Now, the policies and procedures follow HUD's program guidelines and cover operation topics such as eligibility requirements. So if you have a question about your client being eligible for the public housing program, you need to pull their ACOP to see what is any additional requirements. Because again, this training is cover just the overall. So each housing authority has specific requirements. So you can even see the tenant selection process. You can also see the admissions preference, if there's any preferences in the wait list and the procedures. You can also see how rent amount is determined and if there's a grievance process. So if you have a client that applies and they get denied, you can go back and look at, say, okay, what's the grievance process in order to get that overturned if you feel that they do qualify. Now, this document, it must be made available to the public. So if you have any questions about the ACOP, you're calling a housing authority and say, hey, usually they have this ACOP policy procedure book. Usually it's on their website, but sometimes it can be difficult to find. If you can't find it, I used to call and say, hey, can you send me a copy of the ACOP? And they cannot say, well, no, they have to, because it has to be legally made public for others to review. Now we have the wait list. I know that's, common sense, but still I want to go over it. After individual or family has applied for public housing and submitted a completed application, they're placed on a wait list. Now the wait list, it is, again, this is a formal record. This is not informal. It's a formal record of applicants who apply. It identifies the applicant's name, date, and time of application, and the selection, preferences, claim, income category, and their need for accessible unit. So the reason why I want to talk about the wait list being a formal record, I have had clients in the past, well, why can't they jump me over? Well, why can't I have this? This is a document that is recorded. A PHA has to make sure they submit monthly, will depend on the PHA. They have to have a list of how they are keeping the integrity of their wait list. Because if they don't have integrity of their wait list, they can be on a corrective action plan. And this is how they make sure the wait list is fair. So that's why I wanted to talk about what the wait list is. It is a formal record. Now we're going to talk about preference. Preference, it is established criteria used to determine the order in which applicants are selected from the waiting list for housing assistance or unit. Now the federal law does have HUD does regulate this wait list, but there can be state or local laws due to the need of that area. Now, if a waiting list have preferences, priority is placement is given to applicants who qualify for a specific preference category. Now, these are just examples, not and all PHAs do not have preferences. One preference can be if a person is elderly. Another preference if a person is disabled or homeless. Another preference that could be a veteran. Applicants without a preference could wait longer to receive assistance. So that's why it's important that if you have a client, you need to know what their preferences are. You need to find out, can my client qualify for a preference because they'll get them higher on the wait list. And again, not all wait lists have preferences, and the preferences do vary by PHA. And again, the purpose of the preference is to assist those with the greatest need. And we're going to talk about how this affects this population. HUD says a preference can be added for refugees and parolees. So HUD says there can be a preference on your wait list for a person who's a parolee or a refugee. But let me back this up. There's a key to this. Even though HUD says that preference can be on the wait list, you have to work with your local housing authority to get it in the ACOP program. Because even though HUD says it can be a preference, it has to go through a process to get approval for a preference. So this gives you an opportunity on the front line, if you have somebody on your team who does advocacy, to advocate for this preference to be put on the wait list. And then another one we're going to talk about, I'm just going to just briefly go over this. So, but again, it's nice to you to know if you want to understand public housing. There's a system they call the EIV system, and this is a system that's run every quarter to make sure that there's no fraud prevention. So that's why when you're working with a client, you tell them they have to be totally honest about everything, especially when it comes to their income, because this EIV system picks up everything. And if a client's in violation of providing fraudulent information, the EIV will pick up on that. Then you have your reexamination. So that is something to determine whether the household income qualifies for the program. Again, this is something that if you're talking with the client, they say, I want to apply for public housing. You said, yes, you can, but you're going to only get that subsidy or stay in public housing as long as you qualify. You're required to get re-examined constantly to make sure you still qualify. So that's called reexaminations and interims. If you're working with a client that is in public housing and there's been changes to their situation, for example, changes to their income, changes to their household setup, they had a family of 4, now they're down to a family of 3, then they need to report those changes because again, it affects their ability to still receive that subsidy and their amount they will pay in rent. Then we have the Real Estate Assessment Center, which is a REACT inspection. So I just like to just go over those. So when you see that, you understand what they is. So let's go over the flow since we know some of the common terminology, because this is what's really important. So the first thing is the application process. And you need to know, again, what is the preferred method of submission of an application for that PHA? Some PHAs require you to either submit it online or submit it a mail version. Each PHA, again, is slightly different. So you need to know what is the preferred method of application. And then the common documentation. Again, these are just general things that they do ask for, but some PHAs have something specific they drill down to. Of course, you're going to have the proof of income. These are examples, can be proof of income. You can also have certified birth records for all household members. This will be slightly different for your population, and we'll go over that. Social Security cards for all members, again, different. Citizen declaration of eligibility and proof of preference. So if you have a client, even if they're a newcomer and parolee, they do qualify. See if they get a proof of preference. If you have a PHA saying there's a preference for a person with a disability, get that preference for them so they can get that point. Now, non-citizens, this is going to be the typical documentation they're going to ask for during the application process. They're going to ask for the photo ID, if you have the I-94 card, proof of income, the promissory note, or a note from your resettlement agency breaking down the assistance that they receive. Again, the background check, the I-94 card, and then the immigration status, the save is going to be done by the housing authority. So once you understand what the application process is and you know specifically what type of documentation that your client needs to apply, the first thing that happens is they're going to review that information. They're going to review that packet to see if they are eligible. And depending on the PHA, they do have a person that's considered an eligibility clerk. And their job is to review the whole application for completeness. It's very, very, very important that you know what a complete application looks like. Because when you're an eligibility person and you get hundreds of application, if one piece of paper is missing, guess what? They're not going to reach out to you and say, oh my God, such and such documentation is not completed. They're going to move on to the next application. I mean, some do. If it's a smaller housing authority, they might send you something saying, this application is incomplete. We do need such and such documentation, but your larger housing authorities, it's not going to happen. They're just going to reject it due to an incomplete application. The application is then renewed and then either it's denied or accepted. Now, if the application is denied, they're going to send you a denial letter. And that's why it's important that you go to that ACOP to see what your client's course of action is to appeal that decision if you feel that they will qualify for the program. And then the applicant is placed on the waiting list. And I'm looking at time and make sure we have enough time. Okay. And then once they're placed on that waiting list, the application is confirmed. Now they will receive the documentation stating that they did receive the application and it has been moved to the wait list. Now this is very important. It's very important that your client keeps in contact with them if anything changes while they're on that wait list. If they moved, if their income changed, if the dynamics of their family change, they do need to provide that information to them because again, they do call things called purging. So they will purge to say, okay, this person has not responded, or we sent them something to pull them off the wait list and it's a bad address. So they're going to purge them off the wait list. So it's very important that they keep their information accurate, and keep in contact with them. And then let's say they get pulled off the wait list. It's very important that they have updated information. Now, their income is going to change from when they applied versus now. So they got a call to get pulled off the wait list. It's very important that once they get that notification, you work with your client to get everything updated when it comes to their income and their documentation. Because then when they go in, they're going to have an eligibility review interview, and that person is going to go over that same update. They want updated information to see if they still qualify for the program. And if they still qualify for the program, everything looks great, then that's when they're going to be assigned a unit. And I gotta hurry up because I'm looking at my time. Okay, let's jump into the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And I'm kind of jump over some things. Again, this stuff will be provided due to time. I didn't realize I had so much information. Here are some of the terminologies that's used for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Now we're talking about how Housing Choice Voucher. Again, like the public housing, they have a policy and procedure, which is called the administrative plan. That is it mirrors the ACOP, but this administrative plan, it oversees the policy and procedures for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And again, you have the wait list, you have preference is still the same for the Housing Choice Voucher Program. The difference is we have an HQS inspection. That's terminology that's used. And that is very important because this is going to let you know if that home or that unit meets the housing standards. So that's why the landlord needs to make sure that if they decide to be a HCV landlord, they have to pass that inspection. And the reason why I put the HQS inspection on here is because even if you are a case manager or housing specialist, you can use that checklist just to do inspections just for other clients when you're trying to see if a landlord or if a unit is up to par. So you can use that HQS inspection checklist as part of your tools for best practices when you're trying to find affordable quality home for your clients. The one thing I want to cover is called the request for tenancy approval. This is what's commonly known as the moving papers or the actual voucher. So you'll know what that's called. And I'm going to just jump over this due to time. Leah, where I'm at with time. How much more time do I have?
You still have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
And that includes with questions as well, or 10
Yes.
minutes? Okay.
No, 10 minutes and then we can open it up for questions.
Okay, 10 minutes. Okay, cool beans.
Yes.
Okay. So then we have the thing called payment standard, and this is a PHA required to establish a payment standard for each unit. I used to use even when I was not in the HCV program, I still would go to the housing authority to see what their payment standards, because even if I was trying to house a client, I want to make sure whatever a landlord is offering is meeting like the general payment standards in general. Like, is that rent really reasonable? So you can use this as a tool for other clients that are not trying to apply for the Housing Choice Voucher program. And then you have, again, the rent reasonableness. This determines if the rent the landlord or house provider is providing what is reflective of the market, because again, you want to make sure that they're not being gouged. And then we have the housing assistant payment, and that is the contract between the actual housing authority and the landlord. So if you see that, you know that's what a contract is between the landlord and the housing authority. And let's go over the flow. Again, I'm going to have to skip over some things, but it kind of mirrors public housing as well. Again, you want to know what their preferred method of applying. Okay, what the documentation is required, proof of income, photo ID. We talked about that. That's similar again to public housing. It mirrors the public housing application process. And again, non-citizens, it's similar to public housing. So I don't need to go for that. Let's go over the things that are slightly different. Again, it has an eligibility review, same as public housing. Again, the applicant is placed on the wait list, and to make sure that, again, anything changes with your client, they notify the housing authority of any changes while they're on the wait list. And I wanted to mention this, depending on the housing authority, some housing authorities do have their wait list online, so you can check your status online, and you can also make changes online. Again, that varies from PHA, but I've seen the larger PHAs where you can make those changes online, and you can also see where you stand on the wait list. Again, if you get pulled, no, if you get accepted into a program, and then you are on the wait list, they pull you off the wait list, you will get confirmation from them. That's why it's so important that your information is updated with them. You will have an interview, like in public housing. They will interview you to make sure that you still are eligible for the program. And the only thing that's different with this eligibility interview, with the Housing Choice Voucher, you actually get your voucher at that eligibility review. So they'll make sure that, okay, you still qualify. Once you qualify, then you're going to get your actual voucher. And again, each PHA is slightly different. The one thing I need to mention, once a person actually receive a voucher, it's that we call it the clock starts. So that's one term you need to know. Once a client receives a voucher, it calls the clock starts. And again, each PHA is totally different how much time they give them, but generally it's 60 days. They will give you 60 days to find housing. And that 60 days include finding housing and actually getting the paperwork done, having your landlord getting their inspection, and actually have the landlord doing that paperwork. So that 60 days, again, that's the average, but sometimes they expand it out to 90. Again, the PHA is sometimes you can say, okay, I need more time, but it's very important with this piece. If you have a client and they have a voucher and they're not finding housing, you need to have them go to the housing authority and request an extension on their voucher, because the last thing you want to happen, what you call is timeout. If their voucher expires, again, it depends on the PHA, they might have to start the process over again. So it's very important, if they're not going to make that time limit, that they ask and request for an extension, and each PHA require you to give an extension at a certain time while that clock starts. So it's a lot you have to do during that turnaround. So I'm trying to cover all that. Again, if you have any questions, because this is kind of like the short version of this training, feel free to reach out to us. And we do individual or team trainings on public housing and the Housing Choice Voucher programs. We had a TA where we actually pulled the Housing Choice Voucher, their administrative plan, and we pulled their ACOP plan, and we actually did the training for their staff so they could understand that plan for their specific housing authority in their area. So again, this is just general training that I'm giving you about both programs. And then here we talk about the lease up, the voucher, the inspection, and then the family. If the family finally finds a house, finds a unit that they're using their voucher with, then they're going to do a lease up. The lease up is different from the contract that the landlord has for the PHA. So you're going to have a lease up. So the actual client is going to have a lease with the actual landlord. Then the landlord is going to actually have a HAP contract with the PHA, and the family is also going to have a program contract with the PHA saying, I submit to the requirements of this program, and I submit to reporting any changes of my situation to make sure I'm in compliance. That's why it's so important if you have a client that gets a housing choice voucher as well as public housing, if any changes happen and they sign that contract, they're stating that I'm going to notify the PHA in a timely manner if anything changes with my income or with my family dynamics. And again, that was so much, and I wanted to make sure sometimes I put too much in. I wanted to make sure I covered everything, but also have time for questions. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific questions. My email is lpro@cwsglobal.org, or you can set up a TA session. And again, thank you. I try to hurry up and get all that through.
Thank you so much, Lynette, for a great presentation. We are going to open it up for questions, and you can feel free to, I'll give you access to be able to come off mute if you do have questions. And while we wait for that, we can go ahead and look at some of the questions that have been submitted in the chat or in the question on the Q&A box. There's a question from Massey, says a quick question about public housing program eligibility for Cuban and Haitian entries. What you mean? What do you mean by pursued eligibility, and can you elaborate on that?
Okay, can you repeat that again? Pursue what? Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, we can have Massey come off and ask that question.
If she feels comfortable coming
Right.
off.
Yeah,
Right.
the question is about what presumed eligibility means.
Because presumed eligibility, like I said earlier, we might have to update that because things are changing now. So some immigration categories did not qualify, but now they might qualify, and it depends on that PHA. So that's why presume you would have to contact that actual PHA to see if that status does qualify. So that's what that means. Did I answer a question?
Thanks.
Hi, Lynette. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I think it clarifies. But so what are you seeing like in each state that differs based on the PHA program requirement, or it's like nationwide that the eligibility criteria?
Yeah, it is now because, again, I say presumably because one category a while back did not qualify, now it qualifies. So because we are going through so many changes, that's why I put that presumably. So they could possibly qualify now that things are changing. So to be on the safe side, I would contact my local housing authority that I want them to apply for to see if they do qualify. But that's why I kind of put there, because I don't want to say yes, they do, because again, things are changing so quickly. Before I had this, I didn't have a chance to look it up. But that's why I put that. So that's why I want some I did know for sure that did qualify, but other categories they're adding now other categories of immigration status.
Absolutely makes sense.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
How do you decide? There's two different types of housing. How can you apply for both at the same time, or how do you decide which one to apply for?
You can apply for both if the waiting list is open.
Can
Now,
the same application do both, or do you have to have
no,
separate
it would be
applications?
separate applications, a separate
Okay.
process. Now, I do want to add this caveat, not every housing authority have a PHA, public housing, or a housing choice voucher program. So you might have some housing authority, that's all they have is public housing. Then you have some housing authority, that's all they have housing choice voucher. Then you have some, they have both. So each PHAs are slightly different.
Okay, so if you're looking for an apartment, you should pursue both at the same time, probably, right?
Again, depends on the needs of the family. I noticed with public housing, they usually have larger units. But again, when I used to have clients, when I was a housing specialist, I would talk to the family and say, what do you really want? Because there is a stigma attached to public housing versus a housing choice voucher. Because the housing choice voucher, they can choose their own housing as long as the landlord accepts the voucher and also wants to participate in the program. But in public housing, that's government housing. So you need to have a conversation with your client to see, do they want to apply for public housing? Because there's sometimes it can be a stigma attached to that type of subsidy.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes.
Mhm.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any more questions? And again, I did pile on a lot of information. And if you want something more specific to your area, feel free to reach out to us and I can research your PHA. I can pull it, if there's an ACOP or admin plan, I can read it. And then we can tailor that training for your specific PHA in your area. So there's no misunderstandings. Again, this was just in general. There was another caveat I wanted to add. We are adding a place in Miss Grace. She's very great working our website on Refugee Housing Solution. There is a space where we're going to be putting notifications where I get a lot of notifications when waiting lists are opening up with PHAs. So there is going to be a space on our website where you can check to see, okay, is the wait list open in my area for public housing? So we're going to have an area for that because we're monitoring now wait lists because again, it changes so quickly. Like one day, no, we're not accepting applications. And then I'll get tons of emails. Our wait list just open.
Just want to give it a second. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to ask. I have a few minutes left, so yes, go ahead, Margaret.
So my question, I think I know the answer, but I just want to confirm that if a person were to receive a voucher within a particular housing authority, they then need to use that voucher within the geographical region of that housing authority. Is that correct?
Yeah, but there's a thing called port, Miss Margaret. So if they just received their housing choice voucher program, their housing voucher, they require you to use it for a year in that geographic area. However, after that year is over, they can take it again, the housing choice voucher, because it's attached to the individual. As long as they still qualify for that voucher, they can port it out to another PHA to accept it. So say, for example, you're working with me, Miss Margaret, and I live in Chicago, and I just got my housing choice voucher. They're going to require me to live in Cook County for a year. Then once my year is up and I say, hey, Ms. Margaret, I want to port to Dallas. Of course, the PHAs would have to talk to each other. And of course, the PHA in Dallas would have to accept my voucher. And if they accept my voucher, say, okay, we can't accept the voucher, we can sustain that voucher, then I would be, it's called porting, then I would port to the Dallas PHA. I would port to their PHA.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if there are no more questions, thank you to our presenter today, and thank you everyone for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn. We would like to hear from you and receive a feedback on today's webinar and hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. So we ask that you take a moment now to complete a survey. You can use your phone to follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link in the chat. We look forward to hearing from you. And then you will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the recording of today's webinar. And on behalf of RWC, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your week.